Hello, Cosmo 2021 attendees. I hope this video is finding all of you well. I appreciate your interest in the presentation that my current GAs and previous GA put together. The presentation is titled Training the Occasional Graders, Preparing Graduate Students to Grade Undergraduate Sport Management Work. The presentation is given by myself, Dr. Robert Turek. I'm an assistant professor of sport administration at Ball State University. And then my students helped me put together this presentation. One student, Nicholas Swim, he's a doctoral student at the University of Florida. He was my graduate assistant at Ball State. And then my two current graduate assistants, Rodrigo Feller and Malia Biermeyer. So let's go to the next slide. So the purpose of this presentation is to highlight the experiences of my current GAs and previous GAs in their teaching assistant roles. Basically, I'm asking them to reflect on what were the pros and cons associated with the role. What did they enjoy about being a TA? What did they dislike about being a TA? And where appropriate, I'll also reflect on my own experiences as a GA, where I was a teaching assistant at Bowling Green State University, where I received my master's, and the University of Florida, where I earned my PhD. The aim of the presentation is to inspire faculty to consider how much training teaching assistants receive before entering the classroom. And, you know, in alignment with this conversation, with this conference's focus on race and equity, I think it's important to consider the training and the confidence level that our students have in being in classrooms where there's conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or grading assignments in which there's conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, and the inspiration for that comes from what, you know, students are having to experience if they're a TA in a sport administration class. They're having to experience, you know, if you're grading and talking about, you know, the anthem protest and, you know, Colin Kaepernick kneeling, you know, that's a conversation that comes up if you're teaching sport law, if you're teaching sport and society, if you're going to teach, you know, doing some sort of senior capstone class where you're talking about management and how do you, what's the crisis management policy for something like that. You know, you have a lot of classes in our discipline, and most of you who are watching this can probably shake your head of like, yeah, you know, either because it's come up in class as part of your content, or as maybe just a current events type discussion where you've had conversations about Colin Kaepernick, you've had conversations about the Black Lives Matter movement and all the you know, sport influences that have existed there, teams canceling games, players being vocal advocates for creating positive social change. We are just now moving out of, you know, a presidential administration that definitely say, you know, whether you want to say it was a positive or negative one, there was definitely, you know, its challenges, and there were definitely conversations that were had, and, you know, the influence of politics and sport became something that, you know, if you had current event type discussions or whatnot, those would be commonplace in your classrooms. And I have a picture here of, you know, Deshaun Watson, because I had a discussion board activity that I remember doing as a GA at the University of Florida, where students were asked to respond to Deshaun Watson saying he didn't like being labeled as a dual threat quarterback because he thought that minimized his passing ability. And I remember one student replied that they weren't surprised that white people were calling Deshaun Watson a dual threat. He said that white people were had their problems and that they killed Malcolm X and a whole bunch of other things. And I remember as a grad student going, oh my gosh, how do I even respond to something like this? And that kind of also, as I said, inspired me to think about, you know, how are my GAs processing these kind of things? How do they prepare to respond to some of these conversations? Or are they even feeling capable of entertaining them? And so that's what this presentation really looks at and dives into. So what I am looking at here is, and let me make sure that I didn't actually move a slide somewhere. All right, I guess I had done that, so I apologize for that. But so what I did was I just asked them a series of questions to reflect on their experiences. The first one was just, you know, how's your experiences been as a TA? You know, so what did they enjoy about being a TA? Now, some of them are TAs, some of them have been course instructors. I mean, they've all been TAs. They have been course instructors, and so these answers can kind of fit both both areas, the traditional teaching assistantship of either helping a faculty member, usually with grading, or actually teaching and instructing your own class. So as far as how they enjoyed their experience, one of my students commented that as a graduate student, I found it to be valuable to gain experience as a TA. Being on this teaching side of education, I gained insight as to why courses are structured the way they are, how to incorporate learning objectives, and so on. For her, it actually makes a lot of sense for her to be a TA because she has aspirations of working in student athlete support services and, assisting student athletes with making sure that they are passing their classes and maintaining eligibility. And so for her, this kind of vantage point that she's getting as a TA is going to help her in her future career. But for TAs, it does maybe help them understand why classes are structured the way they are. Another one of my students mentioned that he's enjoyed learning how to gently criticize the work of others and how to help them become better students. One of the things that at least I've found, and I don't know if any of you have ever looked at this with your own TAs, but have them grade assignments and then compare, and you grade those same assignments and just do some comparisons. It helps to provide a teaching moment to see how their opinions or evaluations of work matches your own. But often I find that more the grad students sometimes are a little bit harsher, than we are. And one is they don't have to worry as a TA about getting blasted on teaching evals if they don't like if the student doesn't like their grades. But also for a lot of them, I mean, they're a teaching assistant because they were an exceptional undergrad student. And so because they were an exceptional undergrad student, they kind of go in with an expectation that that's the kind of work output the undergrads can produce because they were an undergrad, they produced it, so let's see it. And so a lot of them can be a little harsher than we would typically be, because they have that heightened expectation. Another thing that I learned in talking with one of my students was they said that their most positive experiences they've had with being a TA have basically relied on structure. If the class was structured in such a way where his responsibilities were clearly articulated to him at the beginning, that was nice. If his responsibilities were stated as you're the TA, which means occasionally I'll ask you to do this, occasionally I'll ask you to do that, but there wasn't really a set in stone of here's when you're going to be doing things, so that he would know that lack of structure sometimes could be a little crazier. What have you enjoyed most about being a TA? Two of them both talked about making connections. They talked about how, as grad students, they enjoy the opportunity to get to meet undergrad students. They enjoy the opportunity to kind of invest in those students that are younger than them. Most of them, and if for a lot of you watching, if you're a current grad student or if you're a faculty member, if you think about your own graduate studies experience, a lot of times it's cohort specific, right? The people that are in class with you in day to day are your friends, and you don't really meet a lot of other people maybe outside of your cohort unless you take a few classes in other parts of campus. But some of my TAs have found that they've actually enjoyed the opportunity to get to know the students in the program that is below them, to understand those undergrad students and to invest in them and try to see them succeed and grow. Another student, another one of my GAs talked about how he appreciates reading and understanding how students approach the same topic from different lenses. He actually enjoys seeing, the prompts that I write, and then as he's grading them, seeing certain students take a conversation in a direction he never would have thought. And has actually seen that as kind of a cool aspect of being a GA, is getting to understand and see some of those exceptional students that we all have in our classes. He's enjoyed reading their exceptional work and seeing how they think through things. In terms of what have they disliked about being a TA, this was a very interesting response for me. One of them talked about, and I appreciate her logics when she said the idea of being frustrated when students do not care about their grade. And one thing that I've consistently found in talking to grad students, and for me I even thought it was crazy too, and once again it's because TAs are these students who are usually the best of the best of their undergrad group, is they don't understand how people or how students could just not care. Like, how can you just, how can you be failing a class when, based on just not turning in assignments? If you were turning them in, you'd be passing. Or how can you be struggling in a class because you consistently are losing grades for missing the same thing every week? Like, something's due every Friday and they always turn it in on Sunday. And it's like, how in the world do you keep messing that up, kind of thing, right? And so, some of them have talked about how that's been the struggle for them, because, they will, and I've seen this with all of my TAs, and maybe some of you can, can will nod your head and be like, yep, I'm right there, is they will pour significantly into the comments back to students. When students turn in those first few assignments at the beginning of the semester, I mean, my TAs in the past, I mean, they have poured feedback into them. I actually, my first TA position at the University of Florida was as an intro to sport management TA for Dr. Trevor Bopp. And I remember he would have hundreds of students. I think he had like 120 some students in that class, and I would grade assignments, and it would take me forever. And he would always kind of tell me, he's like, "How come it's taking you so long?" And I said, "Well, there's 100 and some students, and I'm providing, really thorough feedback to everybody." And, it became quickly apparent to me that sometimes students don't even read that feedback. And that can be disheartening, but it also can be really frustrating. And I think that for a lot of these TAs is, one of the struggles they have, is they don't really go into this experience expecting, like, you know as Malia put it, that the students are not going to read the directions, that they're going to make the same mistakes every week, that they're going to not take your advice, that they're going to turn in incomplete or sloppy work. Like, to them, they just don't understand how, when they as a TA are giving feedback that's basically like, hey, here's what you need to do to get a great score on this assignment, that student then turns in the next assignment and ignores that feedback. It just, they find it crazy. And a lot of us can laugh, and maybe you're hearing me say that and you're smiling, because that's been your experience, that you give feedback that they aren't reading, or that you find a student's not reading, and you're going to put their final grade in at the end of the semester, and you think, wow, like, they got this score just because they ignored this one particular thing. And another student mentioned that his big issue about what he disliked about the TA work was the inconsistent schedules. And then, he was, when he says in his second role, I was his second advisor as a master's student. But it can sometimes be a stressful thing as a student when you don't have that consistency. I mean, master's students and TAs especially, I mean, they're balancing their coursework, they're balancing their teaching assistantships, they may be balancing their research assistantships, they may have a thesis that they're trying to write, they may be job hunting, they may be volunteering with a certain sport organization. So they have a lot of things going on. And so if the TA's role is, hey, every week you're going to grade this assignment, maybe there's a weekly discussion board that's being done, and so your job is to go through the discussion board post every week, or you know this assignment's going to be due every 2 weeks, and so you need to do it. Like, that gives them structure, and that helps out a lot. But when it's like, hey, this one assignment's going to be due this week, so I want you to focus on it. However, in 3 weeks another assignment's going to be due, then in one, when you don't give them that structure to plan, sometimes that can throw them for a little bit of a loop, because they're used to being structured. A lot of times these TA students got to where they're at because of how structured they are. They knew as undergrads how to balance their coursework with whatever else they were involved in. And so when you don't give them that structure, it's not that they don't know how to work in structureless environments. It's that's usually how they succeeded, was getting their work done by planning. And so that can sometimes be a difficulty for teaching assistants. In terms of the preparation they received, before I talk about my students' comments, I can say that, in my master's program when I was at Bowling Green, we had no preparation before we got into the classroom to teach what were like a sport type classes, like we would do, basketball or volleyball, or walking, or things like that. So it was very much like physical activity type classes. We really weren't given anything, but then we would have these meetings every so often during the semester to kind of talk about and troubleshoot things. But I think going into it, we didn't really have any kind of formal training, and we certainly didn't have that at the University of Florida. If you wanted, you could obviously lean on your advisor for some thoughts and some recommendations, and you could also ask for your class to be evaluated and for someone to come in and observe you teaching. But a lot of times, I do remember during orientation that I had friends who I met, and they said that they were teaching a class, it was their class, and you know they picked a book where the publisher had the teaching materials, and so they kind of ran with that. But by and large, I mean, they were figuring everything out on their own. They not really ever had a class about like how do you teach. And so that is something that as a field maybe we could do a little bit better of, is make sure that before we assign people to teach a class or grade for a class, that we feel really good about our preparation. And that might involve just revisiting what your preparation is and seeing, do you need to wholesale revise it, or do you need to tweak a few things? But one of my students mentioned how they had a 6-hour training, which sounds like a lot of training. But one of the things she mentioned from that was that it felt like there was a lot of material covered in that 6 hours. And so, although the best aims were to, provide a lot of information that they would be needing for their class, maybe it would have been more appropriate to do something more long term and give them that opportunity to learn this material over time as opposed to just a big cram session. Um, One of my other GAs mentioned that he didn't recall having any training. He had some experience working with English as a second language students, and so he kind of leaned on that of how he used to um, instruct and assist them. And then my last student, Nick, he talked about how he, had a couple different roles. In his first one, he was in person and ran the practical side class. Second one, he did some grading. Then, he had some teaching responsibilities in his doc program, and he noted that there's no formal prep before the class, but faculty members can provide strong feedback after the presentation. And so, it seems like there might be more of a need for us to think about, are we giving enough training across the time frame that makes sense, because we're not necessarily always preparing these students, but we're saying, you're bright, and so go and do this. And sometimes it was kind of funny because I know that in my doc program, and I've talked to other doc programs, so I don't, students from other doc programs, so I know this is kind of a common thing, but a lot of times it's more of a like a, if you study marketing as part of your research focus, then they might just say, oh, well, then you can go teach an undergrad sport marketing class. And it's like, well, yeah, but you might only know a niche area of marketing that's your wheelhouse, and that, and then you don't really know how to teach a class, but now you're up for the next 16 to 17 weeks. So considering the preparation thing might be an important thing for us to look at. What preparation should you have received? So this was just me asking my TAs if they had any thought on what could be done in the future. One talked about having maybe a week-long or a month-long course. Maybe what we do is we say, what do these students need to know? And before the semester starts, maybe sometime in the summer, we ask them like, hey, is there a chance where you could hop on a Zoom call for, at a particular time during the week, and make sure that you resource them rather than kind of just giving them a lot of information at once, but you give them time to talk through things over a week or maybe a month-long course. Maybe you do something where they don't get a chance to teach at the beginning, and you kind of turn things over to them, or they learn how to get in the classroom in the fall, then they get in there in the spring, or who knows. But giving them time to kind of understand what that's going to be like could be more worthwhile. And one of my other DAs noted it would be helpful if he said he didn't really need to know like how do you write a course description or how do you write a rubric. He was more of like, how do I tell somebody, how do I provide constructive criticism? Because a lot of them will read things and they'll say this is really bad, but they also know that they can't just put this is bad. They need to have, they need to try to somehow provide constructive criticism. It doesn't make them sound smug or bad to their students. And so he talked about that. And lastly, Nick mentioned a couple things. He actually volunteered 3 ideas. He said one is he would love to see TAs brought in the syllabus decisions. He said a lot of times the TA work ends up being just kind of doled out to the student and said, here's the class I put together, here's the assignment you're going to be grading or the thing you're going to be doing. It might make more sense to sit down and talk to the student and say, hey, here's a copy of the syllabus from last semester, get an idea, let them get an idea of what the class generally is about and see if they have any thoughts. Maybe they took a class as an undergrad or as a master's student, similar to what you're teaching, and have an idea for a new project, a new assignment that could be added, or they could say, you know what, maybe we could tweak this assignment because I don't think this is going to make sense. Or if you gave me more time between these due dates to grade assignments, I could probably be a bit more thorough and space things out over time, and so on. So giving them a chance to have that. He also noted a comparison of grades would be a good idea. This is something he and I did where before I had him grade some papers, I had him grade a block of them, and I graded a block of them, and we sat down and we compared our scores. And so we said, hey, here we're disagreeing, and so where is it coming from? And a lot of times that's where, and I've mentioned this earlier in the presentation, that's where it became apparent to me that he had some high expectations of what the undergraduate coursework should look like, coming from a guy who was a smart undergrad student, was an academic GA. He held students to a really high standard that not that you shouldn't hold your students to high standards, but sometimes you need to kind of take a step back and say, okay, what should the threshold be for this assignment, and what should you institutionally, depending on where you're at, how should you critique your students, and and how should you be evaluating them? And so that's a great conversation and a great thing to be able to do, and it was really, I think, helpful for his growth. And then lastly, he said there should be some type of TA training to help with the introduction of teaching methods. So some sort of class, kind of like what Malia mentioned, where you kind of learn about like how do you teach, how do you go in and do that? Like you can maybe know a lot about a topic because you read up on it, you research it, you got an A in the class yourself when you were taking it as a student, but now that it's yours to run with, how do you do that? In terms of inappropriate actions, I said, have any of you ever had any inappropriate interactions with students? Maybe a student has said something in a class that you were like, whoa. And, none of them have had that. And so that I was thankful for that. During my time here at Ball State, UF, all the schools I've been to, I've never had students say anything in a class that was just like, that's not okay. I've definitely had students say things in assignments or discussion boards that were maybe inappropriate. And Rodrigo mentions, when he to the closest case I've been is when students say something inappropriate and write discussion posts that could have potentially been harmful to their colleagues. And so sometimes that can be the issue where they see students being inappropriate. But by and large, I haven't necessarily had any of those myself. But we definitely have had students here. I've had colleagues share, and both here and people I know at other institutions. I've had students say things in class that were kind of, cringeworthy, because sometimes you end up in conversations where when you end up having dialogues about what's going on in our world, the intersection of sport and social justice and politics and that. I mean, people's opinions can come out, and I work at a school like Ball State, which we're the state from Mike Pence, and we have a lot of students who grew up in conservative backgrounds. We have a lot of other students who have some very liberal ideals, and so sometimes our classroom discussions are very spirited and really cool because you're seeing these dialogues take place. And so other times, though, it can be like, okay, things are getting a little out of hand. And so I was curious to know if any of them have experienced that in terms of those interactions, but they haven't had that in terms of inappropriateness in the classroom. In terms of dealing with difficult students, most of them have just kind of said that the big difficulty they've had was, Malia noted that she hasn't really had any. The only difficult experience she's had is with students not turning in assignments, and so, but sometimes that can just feel like a little nerve-wracking because these are students in terms of the TA. Once again, exceptional students. They're not the ones who miss turning in assignments, and so that can be difficult for them to deal with students who just aren't turning in work and then are trying to ask for potential extensions or trying to ask for extra credit, trying to argue for an extra point or two on an assignment at the end of the semester because they need, a certain grade in order to pass the class. So that can be stressful for them in terms of dealing with those students. Um, Rodrigo's noted that, with the classes that he's been assigned, especially due to COVID, those things have been online. And he said just trying to explain assignment guidelines week after week to students who just continue to make the same mistakes is mind-boggling to him. We actually did a thing with one assignment where we had students who kept making the same mistakes. So we sent out an email that said, like, if you contact him to tell him that you read his previous comment and you understand why you lost points, we give you those points back. And we still had a large group of students who just never did that. Literally we were saying, we'll give you the points back for not following the guidelines if you just email them and say, like, yeah, I read it and I understand how I didn't follow the guidelines. And so that can be frustrating for some of them. They can find that just difficult to deal with those students over and over again. And then lastly, Nick noted that sometimes students can get angry about grades. I don't know what it's been like in some of your institutions that you're at. I think across the board, when I was at Bowling Green, UF, Ball State, some students have a mindset that if they turn it in, they should at least get a passing grade, and it should probably be a B. Like if they turn in something that they really think is good, they think it's definitely an A because they think it's really good. And if it's just something that they turned in and they don't think it's great, then they think they probably at least get a B. And so anytime you're like, well, this thing was okay, but there were 5 prompts and you answered 3 of them, so you lost 40% of your score. These students will be really combative towards it. And so he said that can sometimes be a difficult thing when students get angry that they lose points because the TA says, well, there were there were 4 questions, you answered 3 of them, and so you lost 25% of your score. So you can at best get a 75 because you didn't answer a question or something like that. And so that's been a conversation that I've had with them of a difficult challenge they've had to overcome. In terms of the 8th question I asked them was I talked to them about, I asked my TAs to think about, to what extent are they comfortable or do they feel that they would be, able to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion topics in the classroom. And I thought this was a really important question to ask them, especially, and this is where I also saw the connection with this conference, both, the earlier content that I've been discussing just from Cosma and, how we talk about, pedagogy and how do you help, students learn in the classroom. But with this race and equity theme, I thought it'd be important to ask them, like, do you feel confident in having these conversations with students? So Malia's quote I thought was fantastic. What she said was, honestly, I do not feel fully prepared to engage students in difficult conversations. I find that it can be very easy to offend people no matter what stance you take on a particular situation. As a TA and instructor, are we supposed to remain neutral on the situation? Are we supposed to give the facts, just the facts? Is it appropriate to share our opinions? How do you go about a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion without putting the blame on an organization, university, person, government, events, etc.? And I thought her comment was a great comment, and I think it's one that I would imagine a lot of students go through. A lot of TAs probably experience this of, what's my role here? If I go into a classroom and I think that, what Kaepernick is doing is appropriate. Am I allowed to say that? If I think a comment that was made by, a commentator on Fox News about the whole shut up and dribble thing, am I allowed to say that is inappropriate? Or am I gonna offend people? And so I think that becomes this really, challenging thing that these students face, and a lot of them don't know where they're supposed to go. And it's important for us to consider, are we training them to have these conversations because they come up in our classes? I teach sport law. We have a lot of conversations like this. Talks about free speech, freedom of religion, civil rights, like those things come up in sport law. Those things come up if you teach a sport and society class. Those things come up if you teach sport ethics. Those things will come up when you teach intro. Those things will come up when you teach management theory and things like that. So it's a really, and even more classes, teach international sport, and you'll talk about, how sport can be used as a vehicle by, nations to, get people to fall in line. And so it's a power dynamic thing, right? And so our TAs are constantly going to be putting themselves in positions where they're going to have conversations about this and they don't know how necessarily to do that. And so I thought her comment was really cool. Rodrigo's was really interesting. He talked about how luckily I got the chance to help my advisor do research on around these issues. So he felt better about his ability to have DEI conversations in the classroom. One, because he himself is a minority, being an international student, but he also said doing some of his DEI work with me helped. But for TAs who work with faculty who don't have a research focus, who don't talk about things like understanding your positionality, being reflexive, and all those things, that can make things really difficult for some students. Nick had a really great comment as well. He said, during my TA experiences, especially my master's, I would not have felt confident in handling conversations around DEI. I think this is a tough topic since most faculty members are not well versed enough to have these hard conversations in their class. So why would TAs be any different? So, that's a very valid point that, we as in academia and in sport management, we do put TAs in a position where they're maybe creating assignments, they're grading, they're teaching their own classes as instructors, and they may be having to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. And the faculty who work above them are maybe having a difficult time handling these conversations, but we assume that these TAs just know what they're doing. They're going to be fine in those spaces. And so that's something that we need to kind of reflect on and think, is there more we could be doing? And I asked them to share some random thoughts they might have. And Rodrigo didn't share anything, but Malia and Nick did, and I wanted to share their two quotes. So Malia mentioned, I have learned that being a TA is a powerful position. As an undergraduate student, I looked up to my TA and took what they had to say very seriously. There were times when I believed that they had to say when maybe it wasn't what I believed or wasn't even true just because of their title. If other undergraduate students are like me, the role of a TA is crucial and should not be taken lightly. I believe it is extremely important for TAs to be trained more thoroughly because of the lasting impact they can have on undergraduate students. You think about it, some of us, we go into the classroom and we have years on our students. Many a year. We have PowerPoint slides that talk about people and events that they've never heard. Isn't it crazy that 2000, we're in 2021, which means 2000 was 21 years ago. Someone born in 2000 is now old enough to you know to drink. That's crazy. Right? And think about all the stories we'll bring up from years before that, or in the early 2000 when our current students were children. And so RTAs can be very relatable to them and can be students that they lean on and look up to. And so making sure that they feel that they, as in the TA, feels confident being in the classroom and able to deliver the content the way that they should be and able to have difficult conversations is very important, because our students might look up to them more than us just because of the proximity and age for TAs that are at least closer to them in age. Nick also mentioned the TA position is so vital to the development of future classroom leaders. It allows students to become well-versed in the other side of the classroom. However, I do think it's important for faculty to identify the importance of the TA in their classrooms. For example, if a faculty member just gives a TA grading work, no direction or guidance, it could lead to a negative experience for the TA. Therefore, integrating the TA in a multitude of different aspects of the classroom may potentially allow for better experience. I deleted the word experience on accident. But Nick was very much hey, we need to make sure that TAs are involved in this process. Make them feel important, give them structure, and give them a say in what's going to happen with this class. They're going to be a very important part of this class. They're going to be grading content that's submitted for this class. They might be emailing students who are attending this class or handling emails from students. Sometimes I would be surprised that students would email the TA as opposed to me for things, but maybe they just know that name better because that's they saw his name or her name once on a graded assignment, or whatever the case may be. And so make sure that you make them feel like a part of the class. So in conclusion, some of the recommendations that we have, or that at least I'm going to put forward, one is the TA should be viewed as co-creators of courses. This is something that this project has made me realize I need to do. And going forward into the summer and into next fall, I'm going to make sure that I sit down with my TA and or TAs and say, hey, here's the classes I'm teaching. Here's the ones I'm going to have you involved with. Let's look at this syllabus together. There's assignments we think we should change. Is there a formatting structure I think we think should be different? I want to know your thoughts and opinions because they're important to that class and to me. Two, TAs may not feel confident discussing difficult topics, so talk to them about that. We need to make sure that we talk to our students about, hey, this is the class you're teaching. Because you're teaching this content area, more than likely these things are going to come up. And also, do you do conversations around current events before class? Because if so, more than likely these events are going to come up. How do you feel about that? Are you feeling good about, if a student, if students get really combative about, you know, kneeling is disrespectful of the flag, and then someone says, well, so is the way that we police black bodies in this country, and are you feeling good about your ability to handle a conversation like that if students get really argumentative with each other? Are you feeling good about your ability to share, information that might be viewed as political or whatever the case may be? Talk to them. Another recommendation or takeaway that I have is that TAs value relationship building. So make sure you put them in situations where they can do that with those students. Allow them to find a way to kind of get to know your undergrad students. They they could be really nice kind of mentors to your students and exemplars of what those students should be doing in the classroom. And so make sure you give them a chance to build relationships. Fourth, TAs should be made aware of common student submission mistakes. It seemed like one of the things that I learned from talking to my TAs is if I tell them like, hey, here's how you use the speed grader tool in Canvas, or hey, here's where the syllabus is, or here's how I change when the due dates are, or how I set the point values, or how I link, certain documents and pages to the assignments and whatever. But that's important for them to know. But the most important things for them to know are, you know, what are the things about the assignments that already a handful of students are going to do as a mistake, regardless of how many emails you send out about it, just because you know your students. You've been teaching at your university for however long, you've graded enough of these assignments, you know that certain students are going to make this mistake, certain students are never going to read the comments you give them and so on, but you know those things. Make sure you tell your TAs that. Make sure you say, yeah, we're going to do this assignment and some people are going to make this mistake. Hey, we're going to do this assignment all semester and some students are just going to ignore your emails. They're going to ignore you're going to give them such good feedback that if they were to take it, they would crush this assignment and they're just not going to listen to you. Make sure you help them realize that so that they can understand the stress of that, because they're going into this thinking, I'm pouring my time into helping these people grow and they're just continuing to make the same mistakes. Give them that knowledge that you have. And then lastly, I was going to say, see the second bullet again. Make sure you talk to your TAs about, are they feeling confident in their ability to grade certain assignments. Last year I had my students do a discussion board about Quintez Cephas, the wide receiver who was now with the Detroit Lions, who used to go to the University of Wisconsin, and he was accused of sexual violence, and the school kicked him out, then readmitted him, and then his accusers were threatening to potentially sue Wisconsin for a Title IX violation for readmitting him without letting them know. And there's an article about it in Sports Illustrated if you don't know this story. But I talked to Rodrigo about it and said, we're going to be having them do this assignment. This is obviously going to be one that could potentially be pretty charged, but also, some students may have very strong opinions about whether or not Cephas should be allowed to be readmitted to the university. He shouldn't be allowed to be admitted, and so on. And so, do you feel good about? I still think it's an important topic for the students to think about and to discuss, because it was a current topic at the time. It fit what we were talking about in terms of kind of like a risk management Title IX issue, but at the same time, it was something that could potentially be a what's what I'm looking for. It could be a controversial topic, and so make sure that they know how to handle that. But I hope you've enjoyed our presentation, and I hope that you have just thought, if nothing else, of the one or two ways in which you might be able to better prepare your TAs for doing really good work in um, in the classroom. And so, if you have any questions, do feel free to email me. My name is once again Dr. Robert Turek. Email rmturek, TURICK @bsu.edu. Thank you for listening to our presentation. All right. Well, good morning. Morning, Nick. How are things in Louisville?
Hey, Dr. Turek. Things are good here. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. So Nick is my former GA at Ball State. He's now at the University of Louisville getting his doctorate. And so when I saw the posting this year for Cosma, I thought about Nick being my first GA when I started at Ball State, and then the next year I got another GA who's from Brazil, and for weird funding reasons, I have a third one this year. And so I have a lot of GAs that have worked with me. And I realized that often I asked them to do some grading and to take advantage of doing that. But I realized that I am sometimes guilty of the same thing that happened to me in my education, where I don't really do much training per se. Like a lot of it is just like, hey, you graduated in this field before, so Nick, you have a bachelor's in sport management. You can grade students in sport management and be my GA, or vice versa. And so I thought of it just from what am I doing to, how could I maybe even just do better at preparing my students to deal with students and things like that. So hey, give any quick thoughts you want to share?
No, I think it's interesting coming from being a TA at Ball State to at Louisville now, because a lot of the cohort with me weren't TAs in their master's program. Were either working through their master's or were just getting their master's as GAs in marketing or development in those spaces. So they came in and had to teach right away. I came in, had to teach right away, but I had this better experience per se in handling students, grading students, understanding what the process was of why we were doing assignments, that kind of thing. So that was definitely a good boost for me in that process in comparison to other doc students. So
yeah, because I know that Nick and I both had a same experience where for my master's student, I did my master's degree at Bowling Green State University, and they call them PEG classes. They're called like physical activity classes, essentially. Like part of my assistantship was I taught basketball, and then one semester I taught volleyball as well because my advisor was on maternity leave. And so I taught some activity classes. Nick, you had was it walking that you guys teach here at Ball State?
Oh yeah, walking. Yeah. That could have been the Olympics, I think, after those 4 semesters.
Which, by the way, whenever we do interviews with students for GAs, we tell them that they're going to be teaching a walking class, and we ask them how they feel about that. And they're like, I feel good about walking. I feel like I can walk. So most of us get experience doing just kind of the check attendance type thing to make sure students are engaged in that activity. But teaching like an academic, traditional course. I mean, my first experience with that was at UF, and they gave me a class of 56 students, and they're like, go and do. And I was like, all right. And the class I was teaching was in person, and no one had taught it in person in like 3 years. So I had to come up with a 16-week schedule to teach a sports sociology class. I bought a book without any instructor materials, which was a terrible idea at the time. And so I just kept making stuff up on the fly. But yeah, my focus was really just thinking about ways in which I could kind of better prepare my students and thinking about that in general, because I got fortunate that my first year at UF, I was the TA for our intro to sport management class, and then I taught sport and society. But I had friends who during orientation found out they were teaching next week, and they had to like get ready to go. And I don't know how things work for your evaluations at Louisville, Nick, and I'd be interested to know it, but we didn't really get evaluated per se. We had a guy named Doug DeMichael that we could ask to come and like watch us lecture if we wanted, and he would give us some feedback. But otherwise, as long as like our evals came back and nothing was a red flag, we just kind of were on our own. We didn't ever learn like, here's how you teach. It's more of just like, nope, just go teach. Someone needs to teach this class, and this is how we're going to pay for you to get your doctorate. So you go do this. Um,
Yeah, and I think it's funny you say that too, because I didn't get a sports management undergrad degree.
mhm,
So some of the classes I'm teaching now, like sport governance and sport intro to sport management, I'm the instructor of record for, but I've never taken these classes technically
mhm,
at the undergrad level. So not reinventing the wheel, but I'm like, all right, like what are the topics in sport governance that we're covering here at Louisville? So it's kind of like a very unique experience of I have my master's in sport management, but it's the classes are way different, the structure is way different. So kind of going of like trying to understand what that classroom structure looks like is very unique.
yeah,
For sure.
because you can't teach it like you would a grad class and be like, all right, our undergrad governance class, we're going to read 6 articles a week and come and critically analyze what the authors were saying. Yeah. So how about to our audience, what was you guys' experience first getting in the classroom and the training to get there?
Hey, Nick, I got my PhD with Megan Schreffler
Oh
Schaefer.
yeah.
Yeah, I know she's down there with you. She and I were kind of a little bit non-traditional. She had been an English teacher, like actually taught English in a school when she came back for her PhD, and I had been working in the field for about 20 years when I went back. So I love it because I remember when they asked me, like, what classes, when you come here to be a PhD student, what classes can you teach? And I said, yoga, I can teach like group cycle. And then they gave me sport law, facilities and management, and organization management leadership. And they gave me a grad class to teach. And I was like, okay, so much for having the easy physical education courses. So I think it's so fascinating to me. So I loved your presentation. I work at a small school, so we don't have GAs,
Mhm,
but what we do is I have about 150 in our department part-time instructors, like people who work full-time in the field and teach a class for us. So
mhm,
every semester I have like 150 people who are just like GAs. They have no formal training. No
mhm,
formal training. So everything you were saying, I'm like, I can use this. I can use this.
mhm,
So thank you for doing it. I was shocked when I went, because I went to the University of Minnesota for my PhD under Steve Ross,
mhm,
and it was trial by fire. They gave me a textbook, and I guess now in hindsight, because it's been 10 years, I at the time I thought, what, I just get to make this up?
mhm,
Like I'm going to make up what we're going to cover every week, and I'm going to make up assignments, and I'm going to make up how many points you need. Um, I never got evaluated. I never had someone team teach with me. I never had a GA. Just as
mhm,
a PhD student, I was just thrown in. I had some classes around 50, but we
mhm,
also had classes that had over 100 students,
mhm,
big school. And because I was 40, my students just automatically just assumed I knew what I was doing. So I got the
Mm.
benefit of the doubt. There's another presentation. I don't know if you've watched the one with the two young ladies uh, who looked at their GA experience as well. That one's
mhm,
coming up this afternoon.
The
And they
contra power harassment. Yeah.
counter power harassment. But
It was the
I like
title.
I like that because they're basically talking about the same thing you are, but from a female perception. But it doesn't
mhm,
matter. I mean, a lot of what they said was the same. You come from one degree into the next degree into the next degree, and now you're just supposed to be the expert.
yeah,
Right. And I can't believe, like Nick said, they have him teaching classes. He doesn't even really, I taught health psychology. Like I've never taken a psychology class in my life, and I've taught health psychology now. So,
mhm,
I mean, we all do it, but I think, these are my questions for you.
mhm,
If you were, so now in hindsight, Robert, you're saying in hindsight, I wish that did I give Nick the right training? Like, did
mhm,
I give him the support he needed? And I'm wondering, if you guys have like a recommendation, here's like the 5 things that I would make sure I go over with a new instructor, or is it more of a process? Like, here's what I do on the front end, and then I'd let them teach for a semester.
mhm,
And then I'd come back, and are there some things you do on the back end? Do you have any
yeah.
advice for that? Like the
So
process?
So two things that definitely popped in my head first is one is, and I realized this, Nick did this when I first had him do this exercise and I thought it was funny, but then my other two GAs have done the same is, and I think I may have said this in the video, they are always, like I have them grade some things and I grade the same things and we talk about it. They always have lower scores than I do. And one of the things I think is interesting is because I'm like, okay, these are academic GAs who were strong undergrad students, so they're looking at this undergraduate work going, this isn't very good, and they're a bit more like, I don't want to say harsh, but they're more critical of it. And I'm like, look, if I grade that way or you grade that way, I'm gonna get terrible evals and they're gonna fire me. So we need to maybe dial it back a bit. So some of that is going through it with them and kind of explaining like the expectations of what work's going to look like from these students. But then also, and I've seen it happen with Nick and with Malia and Rodrigo, my other GAs, is that I think some of them are very surprised in that you give them these tasks and they're such good students that they're like, okay, I'm going to grade these assignments and I'm going to give insanely good feedback so these students can take this feedback and improve. And then like the next submission comes in and they clearly didn't read the comments, and it's just like, and you can sometimes see how disheartening it is if it's like, I spent 10 hours of my life grading 30 of these things and 15 of my students didn't even read what I wrote.
I actually wrote that down, Robert. I wrote down, you give them, how do you get them to read the feedback that you put in the little box, right?
Yeah.
And even the directions to the assignment, sometimes I'm like, they turn it in, it looks nothing like the directions said. So they didn't even read the directions. And so have you guys got any tricks? How do you get students to actually read the comments and then make the changes in the next time around?
So one of the things I've started doing was if I take off points for something, is I've actually started leaving comments of like, hey, you lost points because you did not submit your discussion post on the right day. If you email us and say, I acknowledge based on this comment, I did not post on the right day, we will give you those points back. And going forward, you're just saying, you need to post on Fridays or whatever. And even doing that, like students don't email. We had a thing where 16 students had done that. And we had 2 email us back and be like, I know I need to post on Friday. And so 14 of them just kept losing points because they didn't send an email. And part of that is because I don't know if it's a matter of they don't know how to read like we use Canvas at Ball State. And so I don't know if they just don't know how to read how to read the comments that I put in SpeedGrader for them or what
Yeah,
it is.
I don't know either. It's a good question when you see your teacher view versus, or instructor view versus student view. But I have put comments in a box and almost immediately gotten, as soon as I submit it, a student will email me and say, hey, thanks for those comments. Like I'll say something like, if you're really interested in whatever, being an athletic trainer, you want to look at some master's programs, let me know if you have questions. And I'll get a response almost, so something must trigger it in Blackboard anyway to alert them that I've made those comments, because I have had students react within like 60 seconds. So I don't know how Canvas works, but I know that they pop up, but I know the majority of my students don't bother to read them.
Mine's interesting because I have obviously governance is like a junior senior level class, and intros the freshman sophomore, we don't really know what we're doing yet. And when I leave comments of like, hey, what were you really thinking when you wrote this, like kind of talk me through a little bit more, they'll like email me like, oh, do I need to reply to your comments like that? But the intro class like will not say anything. So I feel like it's more conversation of how do we get on like freshmen, sophomores to get some of that material and like understand that this is a process, not just to check a list and move on to the next thing. I feel like at least here, our juniors and seniors get that a little bit more, but the freshmen, sophomores, it's like, how do we connect with them more to be like, hey, we're not just doing this just because we want to make you do work. Like we're doing this for a reason, a specific goal and an objective here. So that's my biggest like, how do we do it?
Also, since I have Nick here, I wanted to say one of your quotes you gave in one of your responses, I wanted to thank you for. I never actually thought about having the GA be part of creating the class. And you like made a comment about like allow them to be part of like creating the syllabus. And usually I just like create the course and then I would tell like you or Rodrigo or Malia like, hey, here's the class, here's the assignments, you're gonna grade. But it might actually make more sense to sit down with them and be like, hey, so I'm teaching this class. Let's talk about this. And I actually just found out the other day I'm going to be teaching our intro class this upcoming year, which in the fall has like 80 some students, and the spring has close to like 50 or 60. And so I probably want to make sure that I communicate with Malia and be like, all right, so part of what you're going to be doing is help me grade all those students. So let's talk about what we want this class to look like. So I don't just create a bunch of assignments that are going to be pure heck for her to grade. She's also
I think it helps with understanding what the critical objectives are too. If you at the forefront, if you kind of get introduced to that, say, hey, we're going to have, this is what I'm thinking when I put this assignment with this week, or when I think of this long-term project, I'm introducing it here because then the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about those topics. So that's another way I was thinking about that too, of just being like, understanding the process from the beginning helps, like when you're grading those. I'm like, here's what Dr. Turk was really looking for in this because he had this assigned with this. And I think that for obviously with us as like new teachers here, the doc program, we get feedback on our syllabus with our other faculty. We send it along and they give that feedback. And that helps me a lot, just being like, okay, this is how they were thinking about this, and this in comparison to what I was thinking.
So Nick, as a doc student, are you creating courses for Louisville?
I'm actually introducing a class for the fall on digital literacy and sport management, because we have the Adobe Cloud now. So we're going to kind of teach some classes through that in regards to like marketing, analytics, that kind of thing. But when we kind of just take what they have, and they're like, here, kind of go take what you want and like change it how you want. But it's mostly like try to keep this structure if you can. And obviously they have a couple of books in pretty much every class that we teach. So they're like, use our books, please.
Because they're authors. Got it.
Yeah. So
you got to buy Dr. Hums's intro book.
Yes.
Yeah. I literally have Dr. Hums's governance book in front of me as well. So it's, so usually that's what they kind of push us towards, but we obviously don't have to.
Well, and what I think is interesting is, so Nick is a PhD student and he is kind of getting some guidance, but basically you're not creating a class from scratch. But Robert, how often do you create a class from scratch? Because how long have you been working at Ball State?
So this is my 3rd year at Ball State, and I've created a few classes from scratch. Mostly though in our grad program. The undergrad stuff was kind of already in place, and what happened though is at first I was like super excited because I don't know why, but I didn't realize as a grad student that like we didn't order our own books at UF, and so they ordered them for us. And so like when I got here, this was the first time I learned that like the publishers create ancillary materials. And so I was like, this is awesome. So I'm gonna buy these books. And then I bought these books, and then I get these ancillary materials, and I was like, they're so bad. Like they're like either like so boring or devoid of anything interesting. So it's like, I guess it's a template, but then I feel like I'm creating a lot of this content brand new, because otherwise it's just very like, you know, this whole chapter PowerPoint is like 12 slides and I have to lecture for 2 hours. So let's do this, you know, kind of thing. But yeah, I think that I end up creating a lot of new stuff, and I think that I just kind of draw on, and now more than anything, I just kind of connect with people I know who've taught stuff. So like when I got here, they brought me into Ball State to teach sport law. And I took sport law as a master's student and as an undergrad student, but I never taught it. And one of my colleagues, when I was a doc student, he taught our undergrad sport law class as his assistantship for 4 years at UF. So I was just kind of like, hey, can you share whatever you got? And then I kind of have tweaked all that since I got here.
I did the same thing. I called Jeff Levine. I don't know if you know him.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, Jeff, what do you got? And he's like, I got some YouTube videos. So I pulled some of his stuff in. But I think as a grad assistant, as a grad assistant at the University of Minnesota, I did not know. I'm the same, Robert. I got a textbook. I had no idea it had all these other resources. And I know the first test I wrote took 3 hours for the students to take it. Like it was so hard. And I'm like, oh shoot, well, God, I mean, I like totally didn't want them all to fail. So I think I learned the hard way. And the one thing you guys have said, you said it in your presentation, but you said it again today, is that we we don't realize that as a PhD student, like you're the cream of the crop. You're the best of the best of the best. You know what I mean? You're
Mhm.
like the smartest person. You're the hardest worker. You're organized. You got all going on. And to expect your average 19, 20-year-old to be that is not going to happen. And so
Mhm.
I've actually had instructors that I'm like, you need to dial it back a bit because you're amazing. I mean, you're amazing, right?
Mhm.
You're the best of the best in your field, and this is awesome. And I know you want to share the passion, but the goal of this class is that they're not coming out as MBA students or, lawyers. The
Mhm.
goal of the class is that they learn these basic concepts. And I think that's when, Nick, you said something about if you know what the objectives of the course are, so maybe they learn the terms,
Mhm.
but to expect them to actually debate a case with all of these arguments is probably not going to happen because that's just not realistic and maybe you have one student like yourself
Mhm.
who's that good. But I think that's been the biggest thing to me is understanding what is the class all about and what do I really want the students to get out of it. So I mean I really kind of appreciate the thoughtfulness of your presentation because
Mhm.
I spend a lot of time thinking, um, my goal isn't to fail these students, right?
Yeah.
I'll get fired if I fail all my students, but my goal is, and it's not to make them feel dumb,
Mhm.
right? It's to get them excited about it. And I'm so excited. I love sport management. I worked in sport and rec I still work part-time so many
Mhm.
years, and I love it. I love it. I love what we get to do as professionals in the field. So
Mhm.
I've had to kind of step back and realize if I can share the passion. I mean, as awful as that sounds, sometimes that's a small victory in my book.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, the other thing you talked about, and I wrote this down, was constructively criticizing. Can you
Mhm.
just go into that just a little bit more? What does that look like for you?
In terms of like constructively criticizing like the students. So
Yes.
yeah, so I think it's a matter of more so like, so once again, like going to these are academic GAs usually who are really strong students. And so sometimes when they would see this work that, and our GAs aren't dumb, it's like Simon was due at 11:59 p.m. They look at the timestamp, thing was turned in 11:55 p.m. It's pretty crappy. Like obviously this is something somebody started at like 11:15 and just submitted under the gun. But I think it's like helping them realize like, rather than just looking at something and saying like, wow, this was really bad, because you can do that, but finding ways to say like, hey, whether it's that sandwich approach where it's like a good comment, a bad comment, good comment or something, but helping them to figure out how do you highlight some of the good versus just being very direct of you lost points because you didn't do this, you didn't do this, you didn't do this, this section was incomplete. I'll remember that one of the assignments that I had Nick grade with me, that he and I both graded together, I think there was it was a case brief, and the last section of our case brief is like the significance. So like, why is the case important? And Nick was reading this what the student wrote, and they didn't finish what they were writing. They just like had an incomplete thought to like finish the sentence. I mean, to finish their little paragraph. And Nick's like, question mark, question mark, question mark. Like he's like, why? Why did you finish this? Where are you going? It's like, yeah, we can be like, all you can really do is say like, hey, I don't think you finished the sentence, or it's an incomplete thought, versus realizing like you didn't even proofread to realize you didn't even finish where you were going with this. You just kind of were like, yep, I'm done. I started half the sentence and decided to be over. And so I think for some of that too is just having them also, realize that some of what they're going to get is frustrating. They're used to, whether it's a matter of, ability or pride, they usually can do good work. And so, some of the stuff they'll see from undergrads, especially at a school like Ball State. I mean, we don't have bad students, but we have some students who, maybe struggled going through high school, and so they're going to come here. Our average GPA, I mean, our GPA to be enrolled in the major is a 2.0. We have some students who flirt with that, pretty consistently, and so they're going to see some stuff that they're going to just scratch their head and be like, wow, like, there was a template provided, didn't even use the template. This thing had to be 750 words, they wrote 430. It's like you'll just see things that make them go like, why? you know
My famous line is, "Great start."
Great
Great
start.
start to the assignment. I wish I would have seen the final product.
I've started to adopt a please make sure we're proofreading.
Mhm.
In that sense, just like, hey, you didn't capitalize a single I in this entire paper. Like,
Mhm.
that's something that we should have known by now.
Nick, I think it's because they typed it on their phone.
Yeah, that's what I get too. And I think, Dr. Rick, you said it too, when you see an assignment turn in at like 11:55. I've started downloading documents that I know aren't that good and seeing how long it took them in the properties of their Word doc. And so if it's like if it took them 15 minutes total editing, I'm like, hey, I know you didn't take your time on this because I can see it took you 15 minutes to do it. And so I don't know if the students know that is a thing. But that was been a good trick for me, like being able to like actually say like, hey, I know you didn't take time on this. Let's make sure that we're carving off a 30 to 40 minutes here to read the assignment and complete it. So that was a little trick that I've learned in my time here to try to understand what I'm reading and what I'm kind of looking at from students.
I explicitly tell undergraduates that one of the learning objectives I want them to take is to read everything before you submit it to anyone the rest of your life. And so the beginning of the semester, I say, look, none of my assignments are going to be that long, right? It takes 2 minutes to read a double space page or a minute, right? Take 2 minutes and read 2 pages before you submit it. You should do that in everything you submit for the rest of your life, right? Like that's a professional skill I want you to start developing in this class. Yeah. And so I do the exact same thing on everything. You need to proofread. You need to take the time to submit, read something before you submit it, right? On everything. This is a professional skill. And I think when I say this is a professional skill, I feel like that kind of gets it across, like, okay, maybe I'll do it. And of course you don't hit on all of them, but it does. I found that helps a little bit, right? If you make it like, this is valuable for you to do in everything the rest of your life, not just an assignment I know you think doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that it happened for that the social media guy for the Charlotte Hornets who was tweeting about the Nuggets game last year and didn't proofread that he did not spell the word nuggets, and he instead used a racial term, and he tweeted that out. But I can now use that in class and be like, see, I don't just tell you to proofread because it's important. I tell you to proofread because you could get fired because you accidentally tweeted the word. But one of the things I've been really trying to drill into my students whenever we talk is that I always tell them writing is a 3-step process. I'm like, you write a draft, you proofread, and then you revise. And I said, but what happens is most of you set up you work in such a way where you just do the first part, you write a draft. Like, it's like, how many paragraphs does he need? 3 paragraphs? Boom, I wrote 3 paragraphs, submit. Versus like going back and reading, like, how good were your 3 paragraphs? And some of them, and I've had to really also work with that, they will literally take I say like a paragraph is like 5 to 7 sentences. And so they will write the shortest, choppiest 5 to 7 sentences ever. Like their paragraph is 4 lines. I'm like, how'd you get 6 sentences in 4 lines? It's because like, I read the article. I thought Fink made good points. Women should be in administration. It's like, oh my gosh. like, come on, man.
If they work that hard truly on the assignment, you know what I mean? If they work that hard on the assignment that they did on getting as little done on the assignment, no, I don't know. I love students. I think it's fun, but I like I said, with some of the things, like you said, how to get them to read your feedback, and then how to give them feedback that actually moves them forward, get them to read it, and then get them to implement it. Yeah. If we can figure that out, and I think with writing, you guys are talking about typos and spelling mistakes, and now we moved online and so much went into the form of writing, and I think sometimes they write like they talk, and I'm like, I'm not sure what this says, so it just shows how important, Robert, like you said, how important being able to write is. So yeah, I appreciate it.
When it comes to like proofreading, it makes me laugh because I had 2 students last semester who turned in a cover letter for, I teach a senior capstone class. So they had to write a cover letter for a job they'd apply for. Both of those students ended their cover letter with "sincerely yours." And I was like, I don't think that's the kind of message you want to be sending with this letter. And they both were so embarrassed, like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize I did that. I was like, yeah, it seems a little romantic to the person you're applying to. And so like, I think it's really just getting them to realize that you know, we don't always proofread our text, we don't always proofread our social media, but stuff you're turning in for work, you give it a few minutes. You know, give yourself a few minutes just to proofread it. Ask someone else to proofread it for all I care, but someone needs to look at it.
I think it's interesting too, of now that we're not in person as much. I don't know about everyone's campus here, but like most of our students are online for a pretty substantial amount of their 5 or 6 classes they're taking, where before they weren't sitting in the front of their computer, where they were writing and doing assignments on the computer, and then they were in class. So now you're just spending 12 hours on your computer every day. I imagine we're probably the same way of, I don't want to proofread. I don't want to look at my computer anymore. And so trying to figure out that balance of students saying, hey, I'm not trying to give you too much work here on the front half. I'm trying to get you away from your computer a little bit. I've actually started doing a lot more videos. So staying away from writing. Like, I think I introduced case studies in my governance class, and I have 2 that are written, and then like 6 of them are, you have to come on and talk to me like this. Whereas obviously the grammar, and there's a ton of ums and wells, but I feel like it does take a little bit of burden off students, where they're like, oh, I can prep for this for half an hour, do a 5 to 10 minute presentation, and then I'm not spending that extra hour and a half I would have had to do a case study written out. And so that's one way, just like trying to be cognizant of students and how crazy their lives are now. If we think our lives are crazy, theirs are pretty crazy too.